Hello everyone, welcome back to another lesson with me, your teacher, Mrs. A. So today for lesson 2.3, we are going to go over the Japanese occupation of Guam. So the next 2 years after the Japanese invaded the island. So let's do a little review from last week. The Japanese military began their seizure of the island after the Americans surrendered. The Japanese officials notified the residents of the island what their purpose was, why they invaded the island, and why they captured the island, and that purpose was to unite the Asian people and create the new world, in their words. Many of the Chamorros were evicted from their homes without an advance notice. They were not given a chance to pack up their things and make arrangements for where they're going to stay. As the Japanese military made their way to the island, so when the Japanese soldiers were pouring in after the invasion, after they got word that the Americans surrendered and it was time to finally move into the island, they just moved into the Chamorro people's homes, and they didn't even ask for their permission. They just kicked them out and evicted them. So the families abandoned their homes in the city and then moved to their ranches to avoid the Japanese soldiers and to keep their sanity. But then they also used the ranches to once again grow their crops, raise their animals, as this is where they would be staying most of the time, so they wouldn't have to keep going back into the city to get food. The Japanese military then imprisoned 500 Americans and then shipped them off to prisoner of war camps in Japan. Here are the important topics to look out for in this video. Who is George Tweed? What did he go through and who helped him? So we're trying to figure out who was George Tweed and why was he so important to the people of Guam during this part of history. What was different about the Japanese naval rule compared to the Japanese army rule? What was the same? So what was the same between the two types of military, between the naval and the army? Okay, everyone, so this is George Tweed. Now, he was a radio man for the United States Navy, and he was stationed on Guam. Now, when the Japanese took over the island, they accounted for every single American citizen who was living on the island except for 6 Navy sailors. So they could not find six missing Navy sailors. Now the 6 sailors were able to escape the Japanese soldiers after the governor surrendered the island, and they hid in the jungle for a short period of time, being moved around by the Chamorros. So they were hiding in the jungle, and thank you to the Chamorro people. The Chamorro people helped these 6 Navy soldiers navigate through the jungle. They moved them from home to home, keeping them fed, keeping them hidden. 5 of the sailors, though, were captured and then eventually beheaded, leaving only one surviving American, George Tweed. So he was the last remaining American living on the island, and the Chamorro people were helping him to survive. Now, George Tweed remained in hiding for 2.5 years, but not on his own, like I said. The only reason he survived was because of the good people of Guam who risked their lives to keep him hidden. So the Chamorros knew that the Japanese soldiers were looking for the 6 missing American sailors, and they knew that if they had any information or they were caught hiding the 6 Americans, they would be beheaded, they would be killed, tortured. But the Chamorros, they didn't care about that. They continued to hide and protect George Tweed. Now, the Arteros. George Tweed spent the last 1.5 years of his hiding in a cave overlooking the ocean. As you can see here, this is the view that George Tweed had from his cave for 1.5 years. Now, this cave was located on the land of Antonio Artero, right here, the Arteros. Artero's father was one of Guam's largest landholders, which is why he had this land to begin with. Now, Arturo supplied Tweed with whatever he needed to survive: food, water, clothes, firewood, anything he needed. Arturo risked his and his family's life every day, keeping George Tweed alive and hiding in the cave. Now, while Tweed was in hiding on Arturo's property, praying for the day he would be rescued, many Chamorros were tortured and killed by Japanese soldiers for information on Tweed's location. Now, was George Tweed a symbol of hope or suffering? Many of the Chamorros were tortured and killed because they were suspected of having information on the 6 missing Americans. Though some Chamorros knew the whereabouts of the Americans, they refused to give up their locations. Now, to the Japanese, you are considered guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. So they would torture and kill many Chamorros to find any information they could to find the missing Americans. So after the 5 Americans were caught and beheaded, of course, the remaining American was Tweed. Now, many times, Tweed considered turning himself in, but he was told by close friends that he was a symbol of hope. According to some of the Chamorros, Tweed represented the Americans who were fighting for their freedom. So it was a controversy because on one side you had many Chamorros being tortured and killed, and they were going through agony and they were suffering because they honestly had no idea where George could be. But the Japanese believed that the whole island was keeping this American in hiding. And then these Chamorros, they thought that George Tweed was being unfair because many were dying all because of one person. So hundreds died all for one person. But then on the other side, you had the Chamorros who looked at Tweed as a symbol of hope because he was on the side of the United States, and before the Japanese invaded the island, the Americans were living in peace. The Americans and Chamorros were living in peace, and they knew that the Americans, they fought so hard to protect the island of Guam and to protect the Chamorro people, but of course they lost. So Tweed represented the Americans that would hopefully soon one day rescue the people of Guam from the cruel Japanese. So again, like I said, not everyone agreed that he was a symbol of hope. To those, Tweed represented suffering, agony, and the Japanese would kill and torture anyone, even though they said they had no idea where Tweed was located. Now, if you see this picture here, when Tweed was finally rescued, he returned to the island to of course, show his appreciation for the people of Guam for keeping him alive, because he would have not survived on his own. So instead, he came home to a protest. So many Chamorros protested George Tweed because, like I said, to them, he represented suffering and agony. So as you can see, some signs here: what price glory. So George Tweed was recognized as a war hero, but at what cost? What price was this glory? And obviously the price was the lives of the Chamorros. Now, not fun fact, but here's a quick fact. When George Tweed returned back to the island, he gifted Mr. Antonio Artero with a new Chevy. As you can hear, read this sign here. A Chevrolet bought with Chamorro blood. Now, as you can see, these people are definitely protesting Tweed, and they didn't care about that Chevy because that Chevy was not going to bring the lives back of the hundreds of Chamorros who were killed while he was in hiding. Now, the Japanese naval rule. After the Japanese army left Guam in 1942, the Japanese Navy came to the island to take over. So when the Japanese invaded the island, that was the Japanese army. The Japanese Navy weren't as strict as the Japanese Army. They mostly left the Chamorros alone, some soldiers making friends with the Chamorros. The soldiers would pay the Chamorros for their hard work and would sometimes trade with them. So they were, in a sense, they were civil. The Chamorros would work for the Japanese. The Japanese would pay the Chamorros not in currency, but they would trade. They would trade things together. The Japanese Navy also reopened the public schools for the Chamorro children as well as for the adults. So children and adults would attend school. The children would spend 4 hours every day in school, while the adults went at night for 2 hours. There, they would not only learn the Japanese language, but also as well as the Japanese culture. Forcing the Chamorros to unlearn everything that was Western was the goal of the Japanese. This was how the Japanese was going to bring peace to the people of Asia, was to rid Asia of anything Western. But that didn't mean the Japanese Navy was okay with the idea of 6 missing Americans hiding in the jungle. Now, of course, this ended up being only one missing American in the jungle, which was Tweed. The soldiers still tortured and killed many Chamorros for information on the Americans. So yes, they weren't as strict as the Japanese Army, but they are no different when viewing Tweed as the enemy. So they did torture and kill many Chamorros as well. So that's the difference. The Japanese Army was all about turning Guam into a military campsite, but then when the Japanese Navy came, they wanted to again focus on their agenda for bringing the Japanese culture to Guam and making sure that all Chamorros would follow that culture, which is why they opened up the schools. Now, for your assessment, we always recap. Hello. Okay, so let's recap one more time. So for this lesson, you guys learned about George Tweed. He was a United States Navy radio man, and he was the only surviving American to remain on the island because he escaped the Japanese. But the only reason why he escaped was because of the brave Chamorros who risked their lives every single day for 2 years, keeping him in hiding. And he spent the remaining of his hiding living on the land of Antonio Otero in a cave overlooking the ocean. Then he was either viewed as a symbol of hope or a symbol of suffering because he had many chances to turn himself in, but he didn't, so many Chamorros died. But at the same time, he was told that he was a symbol of hope to the Chamorro people because he represented the Americans who would one day come back and liberate the island of Guam from the Japanese rule. Then you have the Japanese naval rule compared to the Japanese Army. The one big thing that the Japanese Navy did was open up a school. So they brought back some sort of education to the island to teach the Chamorros about the Japanese culture. But again, they weren't very different because they still tortured and killed many Chamorros for information on George Tweed. Okay, so here is your lesson 2.2 assessment. This is George Tweed. Hello. So for your assessment, you're going to create a list of interview questions. Imagine that the person that you are preparing this interview for is George Tweed. So George Tweed survived his ordeal. He went back to America. He came back to Guam to see Otero. Now imagine you would have to interview him. You'll need to come up with 10 interview questions. Now make your questions interesting. Remember, George Tweed escaped the grasp of Japanese soldiers and survived in hiding for 2 years. He went through a lot. Maybe not as much as the Chamorro people, but he did go through a lot. So think about what he went through, hiding and knowing that people were dying and being tortured because of him. So you will write your questions below, but I'm going to put a separate Google Doc for you to do your interview questions. Okay, everyone, that's it for today. I'll see you next week. Bye.
That's all, folks.